Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Illegal, Unregulated, and Unreported Fishing webinar. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And we are so excited at Creation Justice Ministries to have this opportunity of learning and expanding our understanding of an issue that covers multiple stratospheres, not only of sustainability, seafood, human rights, but all under the umbrella of caring for God's creation. For those who don't know, Creation Justice Ministries represents 38 Christian denominations and communions throughout the United States, and that includes Protestant, Orthodox, and historically Black churches, all working together to protect and restore God's creation. I want to go over just a couple of things. The webinar is being recorded. This will be available on YouTube afterwards, and when you get your thank you for watching the webinar email tomorrow, it will have a link to this on YouTube, so you'll be able to watch it and share it as you please. And we heavily encourage you to share it, as this is such an important topic that should be discussed widely. Also, if you need closed captions, there is a button on the lower right of your screen that will turn the captions on. The button has two C's, and that should allow you to see the transcript for anybody who prefers that or needs that extra accessibility. And I'm so excited tonight that we get to have our opening remarks from the Acting Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, Jennifer Littlejohn. Acting Assistant Secretary Littlejohn is a career member of the Foreign Service and acts as the Acting Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, where she most recently served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary. Prior to that, she served as the Deputy Director of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff and as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Skopje, North Macedonia. Hope that I didn't butcher that too badly. In Washington, Ms. Littlejohn has served as the Director for Central and Northern European Affairs on the National Security Council staff at the White House, Director for Policy Planning and Public Diplomacy in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Senior Advisor on the Secretary of State's Executive Staff, and Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Overseas, she served as the Deputy of Mission at the United States Embassy in Dili, Timor-Leste. Hope that I got that one right too, or close enough. And the Executive Secretary at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan. In addition to assignments in Brazil, Thailand, and Germany, Ms. Littlejohn earned a Master of Science in National Research Strategy from the National Defense University, a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University, and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Morgan State University. She's a 2022-2023 International Women's Forum Leadership Fellow and the recipient of several State Department Superior Honor Awards. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, she was at Robert Bosch Foundation Fellow in Berlin, Germany, and Robert Thomas R. Pickering Graduate Foreign Affairs Fellow. And I've personally gotten to hear the Acting Assistant Secretary speak about IUU before, and it's been wonderful. So thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you for opening remarks.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Helen, for that warm and generous introduction. It's an honor to be with all of you. You know, as the daughter of a pastor, I know how important the work you do is. And I'm also happy to explain to you how the United States is advancing one of our core priorities, which is our commitment to be better stewards of the earth. As you know, the living organisms that inhabit lands and water sustain the health of our communities and power our economy. This is true for both people all around the world. And it's why we work with other countries and international bodies to promote sustainable fishing. Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or IUU fishing, is a threat to the health of the ocean and all who depend on it for food and livelihoods. It can be connected to criminal activity and labor abuse. Unsurprisingly, it inflicts damage and hardship on vulnerable groups and communities the most. That is why combating IUU fishing is a U.S. government priority. IUU fishing includes several types of activity and can occur in waters under countries' jurisdictions or on the high seas, and the vast part of the ocean outside of national boundaries. It can occur using small boats or through industrial scale enterprises as part of a transnational criminal syndicate. Regardless of how or where it happens, however, IUU fishing threatens the livelihoods of law-abiding fishers and their communities and depletes a source of food for billions of people. The losses in food and income are disproportionately felt by vulnerable, coastal, developing countries who lack capacity for regulation and enforcement. And too often, IUU fishing is coupled with criminal activities like drug trafficking and labor abuses, including forced labor. So for us, combating IUU fishing is not just about protecting fish or even the ocean, which are urgent goals in and of themselves. It is also about protecting people who are engaged in or rely on fishing. It's about preserving their human rights, safeguarding food security, and advancing social and environmental justice. In June last year, President Biden made clear that combating IUU fishing was a U.S. priority when he signed a national security memorandum to address IUU fishing and associated labor abuses. President Biden has called for a whole of government effort and stressed the importance of cooperation with domestic and international partners. Along with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and the U.S. Coast Guard, I chair a working group of 21 different U.S. government agencies leading this effort. We are tackling the problem in all of its dimensions: human rights, the environment, rule of law, trade and commerce, and security. Our toolbox includes diplomatic outreach, law enforcement partnerships, information sharing, and international capacity building activities. Now, there is no one measure that will automatically end IUU fishing. We need a mix of actions that take local conditions around the world into account. So I think I'll share just a few examples of how we're doing that around the world. In West and Central Africa, we support the G++ group of Friends of the Gulf of Guinea. It's a multilateral group tasked with advancing regional maritime security. In the Pacific Islands, USAID's $15 million Our Fish, Our Future project addresses the social and ecological drivers of IUU fishing, which is degrading coastal fisheries and biodiversity. In Southeast Asia, the U.S. Department of Labor is funding a multi-year project to counter forced labor in the region's fishing industries. The U.S. Coast Guard is also working with governments around the world, primarily developing nations, to establish bilateral ship rider agreements to enhance maritime awareness and enforcement. And some of the United States is also promoting the implementation of the Port State Measures Agreement, say that 3 times fast, the first and only binding international treaty focused on IUU fishing. It is designed to ensure catches from IUU fishing vessels cannot be offloaded in ports and enter the global market. This groundbreaking treaty has more than 70 parties covering over 100 countries and territories. And the treaty itself is not a magic wand, of course, but it is a positive and necessary step forward. And we will continue to grow membership in the agreement and build capacity amongst our regional partners to effectively implement it over the coming months, years, and days. The good news is that we know what it takes to make progress: greater transparency and information sharing, coordinated monitoring and enforcement, market-based tools, and international agreements. We also have examples of success, and here's just one. Previously, in the Southern Ocean around Antarctica, illegal catches of Patagonian toothfish, or what we might know as Chilean sea bass, were almost 6 times the authorized limit. Through international cooperation that tightened monitoring and track the trade in illegal catches, that IUU catch is now a small fraction of what it used to be. Working with partners is critical in this fight. This includes working with civil society, philanthropies, local communities, fishers, and other stakeholders like yourselves. In that spirit, we joined Canada and the United Kingdom to launch the IUU Fishing Alliance last year, which brings together a growing list of countries and non-government supporters to work together to build legal, transparent, and sustainable fisheries around the world. Now, we often imagine the ocean as a vast and spacious place teeming with creatures beyond number, beyond our ability to harm. But we have put the ocean under enormous stress from pollution, the climate crisis, and unsustainable and illegal fishing. But as the person trusted with leading the United States environmental diplomacy around the world, I believe we must be responsible stewards of the ocean, just as we are stewards of the land. Should the ocean degrade further, those who will suffer the most are those who depend on it the most. For all of us and for them, we must deal with this issue now. So I hope that you will carry these messages back to your communities and that you will join the global effort to stop IUU fishing. Consider joining the stakeholder partners who are working to expand the impact of the interagency working group that I lead. There is a great deal to be done, and we can do it together. So thank you for sharing part of, or allowing me to share part of your evening on this important issue, and for the invitation to speak with you. And have a good night.
Thank you so much, Acting Assistant Secretary, and hope you have a great evening as well. We will now get into IUU a little more fully. So I know that this is a newer topic for some of our members. And starting out, I wanted to just give us some baseline definitions. So when we say illegal fishing, we're talking about any kind of fishing activity that is in breach of the laws and regulations that are either at a regional or international level, recognizing that for any country, say the US, 3 miles outside of our coast begins our ocean, and outside of that is what's known as the high seas, where no one country has a standing to say, like, this is ours. It is shared and recognized as a global entity. And so, unfortunately, illegal fishing can happen both within and without those different places, but there are some international standards that are agreed to and therefore would hold water on the high seas. When we talk about unreported fishing, we are looking at activities that either haven't been reported or have been intentionally misreported, so that the relevant authorities don't know that there is a breach of these laws and regulations, and it's going around procedures that are relevant to the Regional Fisheries Management Organization, which oversees all of this for the United States. And then when we talk about unregulated fishing, we're understanding that to be any kind of area or fish stock, as we do have farming for fish, such as farmed salmon, farmed cod, where you really can't apply any kind of conservation or management measures, or where the fishing activities are conducted in a way that is really inconsistent with the responsibilities that the state holds, and the responsibilities that are expected of them from the state to be sure that the conservation of living marine resources is upheld under international law. And so we're looking at all three of these things, and unfortunately, many things come in between that. So some of the things that are included when we talk about IUU, illegal, unregulated, unreported, are that people fish without a license, or without, going over the number of species they're supposed to have. For some, it's no bass under 6 inches. For other, it's no lobster under 12. There's different regulations for different species to ensure their survival. And it can be something as simple as taking more than you should. But for others, it's failing to report a large catch, making a false report of your catches. And then sometimes it's using forced human labor to use, to catch. And that labor can be days, months, harmful, move into slavery territory, as these people sometimes are not paid, and we'll hear about that a little bit later. But the things to understand are that when fishers and companies that are engaging in these practices of this illegal fishing and this unreported and unregulated fishing are circumventing conservation and management measures, they're deriving both economic benefit, but their harvesting makes it so that we are having to, well, we don't have to eat, but many of us then eat seafood that is far less healthy. It's far lower quality. And one of the things that gets wrapped up into this that becomes a little bit wonky to look at is how we figure out what counts as a US catch. So if it was caught here, but it was processed overseas and then brought back, does it still get to be labeled that way? Do consumers want to be notified of it being processed in another country where there could be different laws and regulations about what they're consuming and what goes into their body? So not only does this really skirt away from any kind of sustainability and making sure that there is seafood for not only humans, but all of the creatures in the ocean that depend on this food chain for millennia, it also has an effect on us humans. And so as we look at this and we say we are Christians, we care about this because we care about God's creation, we have to recognize that no subject is going to be just one thing. So it's never going to be, well, somebody caught some fish without a license, but it's not a big deal because they'll get a slap on the wrist and that's the end of it. The people who are committing the worst atrocities of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing are not necessarily the random person on the pier without a fishing license. That's not going to do a huge amount of damage to economies, to sustainability, to the management practices of different species. It is huge companies and trawlers and the ones that you hear about catching dolphins and hurting them. It goes beyond. I was on the phone with someone just the other day who was talking about a village off of Guatemala, a small island off of Guatemala, I believe, where in this village, the main job is to fish for some certain species. And you can tell that every single man in that village has had that job because they haven't been able to invest in newer scuba gear or protective gear. And so every single man is either out there fishing or has some version of bodily harm, whether it's missing fingers, missing arms, limps, lifelong health issues. And they, as people, have no choice unless they're going to buy a boat and go into the mainland and find a job there. And we all know that can be unfeasible sometimes. And so it can hurt humans in multiple ways, even if they are willingly signing on to this. But it's not just a matter of one person doing something, but a matter of a system that continues to hurt people and God's planet. And of course, other things get swept up. Humans get swept up, dolphins, whales. I'm sure a plethora of other sea animals that I couldn't name right now, but probably do get tied up in this or lose their food source and become extinct. And so there are several ways that we as Christians can engage in this, ways that we can make a difference from sitting right here at our homes. And we're going to hear about a couple of those tonight. We'll have some discussion on the forced labor aspect. We'll have some discussion on local fishing and how If there's these companies that are undercutting the prices of local fishers and local aquaculturists, then we're not even able to support our local species and our local economies. And we'll get to have some time to ask some questions and just learn about the intersectionality of this issue, recognizing that it's not as talked about, and this will be the beginning of a learning journey for many of us. And so with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, who will discuss the forced labor aspect of this really important topic, Johanna Lee, who is a staff attorney at Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum, working to promote migrants' workers' rights and advance corporate accountability to eliminate forced labor in global supply chains, particularly in the seafood sector. Before joining the team as a staff attorney, Johanna worked with the Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum as a legal fellow and served as a visiting researcher at the Institute for Population and Social Research, Mahidol University in Thailand. We've got a lot of international names, so you might have to Google some of those to see what the correct pronunciations are. And Johanna holds a JD from Harvard Law School, a master's in human rights and humanitarian action from the Paris Institute of Political Studies, and what I believe is a Bachelor of Arts. It says AB in Social Studies from Harvard College. So thank you so much. I'll hand it over to Johanna.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you again for the invitation to speak. Today, I'd like to discuss the importance of ending the vicious cycle of IUU fishing and forced labor by promoting fishers' rights at sea through the guarantee of fishers' access to secure and free Wi-Fi on board distant water fishing vessels. Oftentimes, it is the same distant water fishing vessels that perpetrate both IUU fishing and forced labor. Around the world, an estimated 128,000 fishers, many of whom are migrant workers, work in conditions of forced labor. And under US and international law, forced labor is work that workers have not entered into voluntarily and that they cannot exit without penalty. Common indicators of forced labor reported by fishers include physical abuse and intimidation and threats, abusive living and working conditions, such as inadequate food or water on board, excessive overtime, such as 18-hour workdays with no days off, the confiscation of identity documents, such as passports or work permits, the withholding of wages, and debt bondage resulting from steep recruitment-related fees. To end these injustices at sea, GLJ ILRF's union partner, the Indonesian Seafarers Gathering Forum, or FOSPI, has been leading a campaign called Wi-Fi Now for Fishers' Rights, which seeks to promote the transparency and accountability of the distant water fishing industry by empowering fishers with access to Wi-Fi so that they can communicate with their families, faith-based organizations, union representatives, government agencies, and other advocates while they are at sea. And that way, fishers will be able to report illegal practices in real time and uphold their fundamental labor rights, which includes their right to freedom of association and right to work in a safe and healthy workplace free of discrimination or forced labor. The lack of transparency and accountability of the distant water fishing industry allows the vicious cycle of IUU fishing and forced labor to continue. IUU fishing occurs because it is highly profitable. It is estimated that worldwide, fish caught via IUU fishing produces gross revenues ranging between $9 and $17 billion annually. However, IUU fishing is one of the greatest threats to ocean health and also one of the biggest causes of global overfishing. So today, more than 90% of fishery resources are either fully fished or overexploited, which increases the risk of ecosystem collapse and jeopardizes people's livelihoods and food security. However, the scarcity of fish in the oceans resulting from IUU fishing then incentivizes forced labor. And this is because as fisheries close to shore are depleted, fishing vessels end up venturing further out to sea. And these longer voyages require higher fuel and labor costs. And so to cut labor costs, many vessel owners end up hiring migrant workers who tend to have fewer labor protections under the law. The migrant fishers are then often underpaid and forced to live and work in extremely dangerous conditions. And as the vessels travel further out to the high seas and visit ports less frequently, it becomes easier for captains and vessel owners to get away with IUU fishing and labor abuses. These illegal practices occur in the middle of the ocean, which essentially functions as a no-union zone where fishers are completely isolated and therefore unable to contact their union representatives or other advocates to uphold their fundamental labor rights. So to increase the transparency and accountability of the distant water fishing industry, GOJ ILRF's union partner, FOSPI, has been spearheading the Wi-Fi Now for Fishers' Rights campaign. FOSPI is a self-organized group of Indonesian fishers in Taiwan with more than 2,000 members through 12 regional fishers associations. Founded in 2006, FOSPI organizes social and cultural activities for fishers, offers a temporary shelter for fishers in need, and represents fishers dealing with labor violations with local authorities and recruitment agencies. Now, Taiwan has the world's second largest distant water fleet in the world, only second to China, and largely relies on migrant labor, mostly hiring workers from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, while granting them second-tier labor protections. The fishing vessels remain at sea without visiting a port for up to 10 months, or illegally even longer, during which migrant fishers work in complete isolation. So even when they experience labor abuses, ranging from wage theft and health and safety violations to forced labor, the fishers have no way of reporting grievances and remain trapped working what is known as one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. For example, an Indonesian migrant fisher named Nofian worked on a Taiwanese distant water fishing vessel without access to Wi-Fi for 4 years. And after being at sea for more than a year, Nofian finally managed to contact his family at port and learned that his salary, which his family depended on, had not been sent back home as agreed in his employment contract this entire time. And because they had no news from Nofian for more than a year, his family thought that he had abandoned them and his wife had remarried. Another example is that of an Indonesian migrant fisher whose eye was accidentally punctured by a fish hook while at sea. However, the vessel would not turn back to shore so that the fisher could receive immediate medical attention. And instead, the fisher had to wait an additional several months before the vessel would dock at port. And by the time he could finally receive medical care, it was too late because he had gone blind in that eye. The abuses in Taiwan's distant water fishing industry are well documented, and this is why Taiwan caught seafood is currently on the U.S. Department of Labor's list of goods made with child labor and forced labor, why several Taiwanese vessels are still subject to import bans by the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and why Taiwan is currently identified by the U.S. Interagency Working Group on IUU fishing as one of 5 priority flag states in the world for IUU fishing and forced labor. Nonetheless, the seafood that migrant fishers in Taiwan's distant water fishing industry catch continues to be bought and sold in the United States by multinational corporations and unknowingly purchased by U.S. consumers. Seafood companies at the top of the supply chain also play a major role because they continue to refrain from disclosing their supply chains down to the vessel level and continue to rely on voluntary initiatives that have proven to be ineffective because they're largely captured by industry interests. So how then can fishers end the culture of impunity that dominates the Taiwanese distant water fishing industry and ensure that their fundamental labor rights are respected? According to a survey of migrant fishers in Taiwan and Indonesia, the most needed policy change to eliminate labor abuses at sea is the provision of secure and free Wi-Fi on vessels, which would allow fishers to call for help in real time instead of having to wait for months until they reach shore. And this is why FOSPI and GLJILRF are working with a coalition of migrant and human rights organizations based in Taiwan and the UK, namely the Taiwan Association for Human Rights, Stella Maris Center Kaohsiung, Serve the People Association, and Humanity Research Consultancy, to call for Wi-Fi to be guaranteed to all workers in Taiwan's distant water fleet. Last year, our 6 organizations joined forces to build our campaign by collecting 1,000 signatures for our Fishers petition and more than 900 signatures for our Allies Pledge. We officially launched the campaign this February and have been actively engaging a wide range of stakeholders globally ever since. The campaign has met with key government agencies and officials, vessel owner associations, and a trade union confederation in Taiwan, as well as with US government agencies, members of the Biden administration, and the AFL-CIO. We've also shared our message to corporate audiences at the Seafood Expos in both Boston and Barcelona, and we've met with the trade negotiators in the US and Taiwan to propose language for the labor chapter of the US-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade. We've also begun to engage with seafood companies to discuss potential for collaboration on a pilot project to bring Wi-Fi to Taiwanese distant water fishing vessels in the context of binding agreements that guarantee protections for worker organizing. To end the vicious cycle of IUU fishing and forced labor in the distant water fishing industry, it is necessary for fishers to be able to contact their families, faith-based organizations, union representatives, government agencies, and other advocates to uphold their fundamental labor rights. And this is why FOSPI, GLJILRF, and our other campaign partners are working hard to fight for fishers' rights to Wi-Fi access on board vessels. So now in our next phase, we are preparing to escalate our campaign by delivering the Fishers Petition and Allies Pledge to Taiwan's premier next month. We are also urging the U.S. Trade Representative to support a mandatory approach to ensuring fishers access to Wi-Fi on vessels. In addition, we plan to bring our campaign to Japan and the EU, which are some of the top buyers of Taiwanese seafood, as well as to begin corporate campaigning. So to support our campaign, we ask that you please sign our Allies Pledge, which is available both on the campaign Facebook page and website. And there will also be additional opportunities to support our campaign moving forward. And we hope that we can count on you among our allies. So that is all I have for you today. And thank you very much for listening. I will pass it back to Helen.
Thank you, Joanna. So informative and helpful. I found myself even taking notes for following up and things to look at the grocery store. So excited that while we are focusing on something that is unfortunate and really an ugly side of this, we're also able to focus on some joy and some local storytelling to really hear about how we may be able to support local fishers and aquaculturists, and to hear a little bit more about how it may affect those in the US who do more local fishing. And so I'd love to introduce Amani Black, who is the founder of Minorities in Aquaculture. Amani was born and raised on the Eastern Shore of Maryland in Chestertown. She's always had a passion for restoration and conservation since she was a young girl, and found great interest in the rapidly growing shellfish aquaculture industry after completing an aquaculture training program at Virginia Institute of Marine Science in 2016. Since then, Amani has worked on oyster farms, nurseries, and hatcheries along the Eastern Shore of Virginia and Maryland. From 2018 to 2020, she was the assistant hatchery manager for Hooper's Island Oyster Company, having the opportunity to work in all aspects of shellfish grow out. Through her love for her career, Amani founded Minorities in Aquaculture, a nonprofit organization that strives to empower and support women of color in the aquaculture industry by educating women of traditional waterman legacy and heritage in coastal communities, while providing opportunities such as paid internships, technical skills, training, and career development resources in the new wave of commercial fisheries. In addition to developing the nonprofit, Imani is also pursuing a master's degree at the University of Maryland's Center for Environmental Science, researching historical minority engagement in commercial fisheries in the Chesapeake Bay. Imani, thank you for having the time to stop by.
Yeah, thank you so much, Helen, for that great introduction. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Imani Black. I'm the founder of Minorities in Aquaculture. And so this conversation has been super interesting so far with all that we've heard from Joanna. And I was just, sitting here contemplating or thinking about how that really coincides with aquaculture. And so for those of you who don't know what aquaculture is, it's very simple. It's basically just seafood marine farming. So the same ways that we grow our terrestrial plants and fruits and vegetables, livestock, things like that on land is also the same ways that we do use that same animal husbandry in the water for aquaculture. So a couple of the sectors in aquaculture that are really big worldwide are shellfish, so oysters, clams, abalone, gooey duck, things like that, finfish, obviously salmon, trout, tilapia, all those different types of fish that we eat. Also, seaweed is a huge thing. Kelp is becoming a huge market right now. And the great thing about aquaculture is that it wasn't introduced into our fisheries just out of random. It was introduced to our fisheries, specifically in the Chesapeake Bay, to be able to help the wild populations rebound and replenish so that we aren't just going into our wild populations of marine species for food. And so now aquaculture, since its delivery into the United States, but kind of happening for decades on end globally, is now one of the fastest growing industries in the world. And in the United States specifically, 84% of our seafood is already imported into the United States. So frozen fish that you get from the grocery store, even sometimes fish and seafood in the case can also be imported as well, depending on obviously the source. And about 60% of that, so 60% of what's imported is farm raised. And so I know that I wanted to say farm raised because I know that that is getting kind of a bad rap in a lot of conversations of farmed is bad and, we shouldn't eat farmed. And I'm here to tell you that actually aquaculture by 2030 will be the only focal point of our sustainable seafood resource when it comes to seafood. So kind of the only way that we're going to be able to have sustainable seafood worldwide, especially in the United States, is going to be from aquaculture. And so when it comes to the word farmed, again, it's the same thing as, terrestrial farming. That's just where that farmed word comes from. When it comes to oyster aquaculture, which is the sector that I specifically have been building my career in, like it was said in my bio, is one of the most sustainable sectors of aquaculture, not only because it helps, with our economic value and industry of oysters, but also growing oysters in the ways that we do in the hatchery, on the farm, things like that, are also restorative too. So they have a restoration effort and also a consumer effort all at the same time. So shellfish are one of the most sustainable proteins on the planet when it comes to the size of an oyster and how much nutritional value you can get out of an oyster. When it comes to finfish, which is probably the most talked about industry when it comes to aquaculture, there's a lot of misinformation around our industry in general, but especially finfish. And so there are, even though I'm an advocate for aquaculture, I can be very honest and say that there are different facilities and companies that do use antibiotics and different things like that in their fish in order to keep them safe or keep them from getting diseases, kind of the same thing that we do with crops that kind of makes, that argument, kind of heated is, pesticides. So it's kind of the same thing in the fish farming industry. But I've worked at fish hatcheries in the United States, specifically Hudson Valley Steelhead Trout Farm, that is completely zero waste and completely biosecure, which means that they don't use any antibiotics or anything on their fish, and especially in their feed. And also, too, they are not putting anything back out into the environment. Again, aquaculture has the ability to be restorative, and also we can benefit also from it as well. And so in that sense, they are a zero waste facility. So all of that fish waste actually goes into their basement and is then turned into fertilizer for their multi-million-dollar hemp farm in their basement of this fish facility. So not only are they not putting anything out into the Hudson River that is harmful to any of the other species that are there, but they are also then putting some of those grown fish or steelhead trout back into the Hudson, because that's one of the species that is struggling in those areas. So just that one facility that also, gives fish to, or supplies fish to, kind of that whole entire region of New York, and also Massachusetts, New Hampshire, a lot of the surrounding states. You can also look them up online and get fish, shipped to your house. There's also Quare, which is a Norwegian fish company that also just now got into Whole Foods. So they have salmon dogs and different things like that. The great thing about Quare is that they've worked with their local communities on how this fish facility will not impact the local fisheries that is happening around them. So they're working with their local fishing community, their local watermen, to be able to help the seafood industry and kind of work, hand in hand with it, instead of competing, as it's kind of pictured between traditional fishing and aquaculture, or just farm raised. And so so this kind of gets me into kind of minorities in aquaculture, obviously, because I started the organization back in 2020, because I had been in the oyster aquaculture industry for about 5 years at that point. And I had never worked or knew another person of color that owned a farm or was in a leadership role in aquaculture. And so for the longest time, I just thought that was because I was in Maryland and Virginia and really hadn't explored different parts of aquaculture. So I started asking a bunch of people that had started hatcheries, worldwide, or had been consultants, or were in different parts of aquaculture, and no one could really give me an answer on who I could talk to, or who that they knew other than me that was a person of color. And so as I was, thinking about the organization, thinking about where aquaculture is going to go by 2030 as that focal point of our sustainable seafood, and then also thinking about the ways that we used to traditionally fish, especially on the Chesapeake Bay with our coastal community, fishing and our, fishing industry is a core element of our heritage and our legacy in this coastal community. And so when I started to think about both of those different industries, I started to think about, well, as a person of color and also as a woman, I'm a minority. I'm a woman of color, which means I'm a double minority in aquaculture. But historically, people of color have been the backbone of commercial fishing, and a lot of commercial fishing industries that are still very prominent today. And so when you look specifically at the Chesapeake Bay, this gets into my research, I'm looking at the historic African-American involvement in Chesapeake Bay commercial fisheries, because in particular, African-Americans, especially when they were enslaved Africans, really built the commercial fishing industry, being pushed to the water's edge. Living on the water at that time was not a high commodity. It was not a high society type thing. It was a very low community-based thing. I'm sorry, my cat is just taking over the show. Hey, stop it. Okay, sorry. And so with African Americans, and then, enslaved Africans, and then African Americans, they, over those generations, stayed in the fishing industry and were really the prominent demographic in this industry for many decades. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution and the Jim Crow era and all these other kind of domino effects that I'm looking into in my research of really what were the domino effects of why we went from hundreds of thousands of African Americans that were in the fisheries to now only having 10 to 11 that are still living and still working commercially in the Chesapeake Bay. There's had to have been something that got us from point A to point B, and that's what I'm really interested in. Not only looking at how ecologically the Chesapeake Bay has changed, but really how those ecological changes have, really impacted the coastal community that has built around it. So with minorities in aquaculture and understanding that history, I really brought that into the organization. And we're really building the organization to be a bridge between women of color and the other underrepresented demographics of aquaculture, and really bringing them along into an industry that, one, our ancestors were already a part of. So there's already a seat at the table for us, but also an industry that is already connected to everybody, no matter what race or background you are, or what economic status you are. It should be explored, and it should be encouraged and empowering for everybody that is affected by it to be a part of it and to care about it just in general. So with minorities in aquaculture, we give not only that support and that network, but again, we're also that bridge between the underrepresented demographics that need advocacy in this new wave of commercial fisheries and the aquaculture industry themselves. Aquaculture is on the verge of losing millions of dollars in the next couple of years because of our decreased workforce development. And so not only is Minorities in Aquaculture the only workforce minority focused organization in the world when it comes to the industry right now, but we also are actively giving the industry and also communities the information that's really lacking between the two. I really feel like that the common misconceptions that come out from aquaculture and farm raised are not the community's fault. They're aquaculture's fault. They're the industry's fault, because we have all of the knowledge. We have great experts. We have great innovators, and that information isn't readily available for the community. It's only opinions or, kind of pieces that don't have all of the facts. But if there's nothing for a consumer to look up to combat that knowledge that they just learned in that documentary or that article or whatever, we can't really blame people for being scared to try something that is kind of really sweeping and causing a lot of ruckus in the conversation. So with Minorities in Aquaculture, we're not only providing fully paid internships, so stipend, housing, transportation, meals, kind of any financial or just obstacle that a woman of color has been facing or could face trying to get into aquaculture. We try to support her in that. We also are working to support the other underrepresented demographics and just make sure that each voice and each experience is at the seat at the table. So right now, we just finished our internship program, 8 weeks with 11 women of color from all walks of life and all journeys in 6 different states around the country that we're working at either oyster farms or aquaculture institutions or different labs and doing research and things like that for the summer. And now we have our kind of half-year, full semester interns that are starting in Alaska at University of Southeast Alaska, and then in Pebble Beach, California at the Sunflower Star Lab, which is a chitoderm aquaculture hatchery. So with a variety of different opportunities, we're really hoping to continue to put out the information that the community is really wanting about aquaculture, but then also advocate within the industry for the people that have been underrepresented and underserved. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That was so incredibly informative and wonderful to learn about. And we'll now be able to move into a time of questions. And you can use either the chat function or the Q&A box, and we'll be able to see those and answer any questions you may have. I know I wrote down a couple, so I can get us started off while people get to typing. But I think one of my first questions is for Johanna, and I'm really excited to hear that many ships could get fitted with Wi-Fi and make that easier. A really good Band-Aid solution, I guess, in the interim while we do better. How common is it for these fishers to have phones or other technology to be able to use that Wi-Fi, or is that another barrier they might face?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most fishers do have their own smartphones. So the issue isn't that they don't have mobile phones that they can use to access the Wi-Fi. The problem is that there is no guarantee that even if there is Wi-Fi that they could use it. So actually some fishing vessels do have Wi-Fi, but it's only allowed for the captain or senior crew to use, and the fishers themselves are not given access. And so for our organization and for our campaign, we are promoting access to Wi-Fi, which also includes guaranteed access, right? So we'd want some kind of binding agreement among the different parties, the vessel owner associations or the vessel owners themselves, and then also with the unions representing the fishers, and potentially even seafood companies that are sourcing from these vessels to agree to ensure that there will be no, retaliatory measures or any kind of barriers imposed to prevent fishers from accessing the Wi-Fi.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really great to hear. Thank you. And it looks like people may still be typing or may just be in awe because it is a lot of information to process. But I have follow-up questions. I'm prepared for all of us. I think one of my other questions for you, Johanna, is do we have any way of knowing which countries are using forced labor? You cited Indonesia and Taiwan. And of course, I immediately noted, start looking at all the seafood at my grocery store to see where it's from. But do we have any kind of information or stats or data on other countries to look out for, or to be petitioning our congressional leaders or administration to really zero in on?
Yeah, so I mean, the State Department's TIP office, the Trafficking Persons Office, with their TIP report, they will highlight different countries and highlight if the fishing sector, if there's forced labor that is quite prevalent in the sector. And then in addition, the 5-year national strategy that I mentioned earlier, that identifies Taiwan as one of 5 flag states. There are 4 others that the US government has identified as being a priority state that they'd like to focus on in terms of combating both IUU fishing and forced labor. So yeah, I think the US government has a lot of different resources in identifying which countries are at higher risk of forced labor in their fishing sector.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. And then I have a couple of questions for you as well, Amani. I think my first one is, what's needed to start a hatchery? How big are these, and kind of what are we thinking of when we're talking about a hatchery?
Yeah, so it's not that easy to start a hatchery. It's much easier to start an oyster farm than an oyster hatchery. And so there's 3 main kind of pinpoints of let's say the aquaculture process: hatchery, nursery, and farm. And the best way you can think about it is babies, teenagers, and adults. Mm-hmm. So babies are made in the hatchery. That's where, specifically for oyster aquaculture, that's where we're mimicking a lot of what is naturally happening for oysters. So oysters are broadcast spawners, which means that they need each other to reproduce and to spawn. Jackson, thank you. Sorry, I know you've heard this spiel tons of times. I understand. So that's where we just mimic what's happening naturally. So we basically trick the moms and dads, and we put them in a system where we make them think that it's summertime temperatures. So we start this process in January. Make them think it's summertime temperatures because that's what they naturally do in the wild. As soon as the waters get warm, they're like, oh, okay, if there's more food available, I can eat more. I'm going to pack on those egg and sperm. So we basically just do that in the hatchery in January. Then once all of those oysters, or most of those oysters, are sexually mature, then we plummet that temperature down. So then it's winter. It gives them a winter signal. So they're like, oh, it's winter time. I need to hold on to whatever I have until next season. So then that's how we can control how many oyster larvae we're producing, so that we can make sure that like we're able to care for, hundreds of millions of oyster larvae at a time. And then just in the hatchery, basically, we are making sure that they have clean water every other day, clean tanks, nothing's competing with them. They're not competing with each other. We're tracking their, obviously their growth and their, viability. And so like how many are alive like every 2 days when we drain down. But also the most important part of a hatchery is your microalgae. So we grow the food that oysters would naturally eat in the Chesapeake Bay or any waters. We just grow them in-house, so that we also know that those cultures are clean, viable, and all of the nutrients that they need, they're getting straight away. And so that's probably between 18 to 24 days that an oyster is free swimming. So that free swimming stage is just them in the hatchery stage. And then they move to their teenager stage when they're ready to set on something for a long period of time.
Awesome. That's so fascinating. I feel like I'm gonna go down.
It's a lot more complicated than it sounds. Like,
oh, I'm definitely gonna go through like a Google rabbit hole. Like I'm gonna learn all the things.
Yeah.
But the other thing that really caught my attention was you mentioned that it's just kind of hatchery by hatchery, farm by farm, as far as like antibiotics and the really cool farm you mentioned where it's just a continuous cycle and really renewing. Do consumers just have to rely on their own research to figure out which ones do that? Or are there like places that just publicize it? How do people go about figuring out which ones are really sustainable and helpful? They go about.
Sure. Yeah, that's a common question that I get. And that's a really great question because there are a few, different websites and things out there. There's the Monterey Bay like Seafood Watch that everyone's, been using. There's a little bit of discrepancy with it now, just based off their like most recent like publications, but that's a whole different story. But if you're in the grocery store, you can actually look on the label to see kind of like what you were talking about before of what is considered like a US catch. So if a label has the species scientific name on it and all the information about where that comes from, so most of the time it'll say farm, so farmed in Indonesia or wherever. But if it just gives you kind of like, just junk words of like, and it was packaged with, sustainable saran wrap and blah, blah, like stuff that has nothing to do with the fish, then you know that they're just trying to give you the runaround. But a label that has very concise information of what species of fish it is, where it's coming from, where it was distributed to, if it has a really pinpoint location of where that fish comes from, then you can look further into the distribution plan or the company that's like doing it. But you can most likely guarantee that they are sustainable, especially when it comes to like tuna fish. Dolphin safe, that dolphin safe label is not real unless it is rod and reel caught tuna. So there's a difference between net caught tuna, obviously, because then there's bycatch all day long. But rod and reel, that means they have to catch one fish at a time. So there's no possible way that a dolphin, there is a possible way a dolphin could get hooked up, but it's mostly just one fish at a time instead of a bunch of fish at one time. So there's different languages that you can look into that are like, okay, here's an indication. It might not say, oh, this is sustainably farmed, but if it has the MSC logo on it, that's sustainable, that's trackable and sustainable, but it has those other languages on there too. It's most likely sustainable as well.
Thank you. That's all so helpful. And I see that we're coming to the end of our time. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight and all the people who registered so that they could get this recording and watch it later. We're so grateful that the Acting Assistant Secretary was able to give opening remarks. And thank you so much, Johanna and Amani. This has been so informative. And if nothing else, I got to nerd out, which is just wonderful. So thank you both so much, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.